My name is Dylan King, and I've spent the past 2 months researching the question, what in the past 50 years has led to the economic recession of Puerto Rico, and how has Hurricane Maria further impacted the island? This is Puerto Rico. It's an economic commonwealth and property of the United States. And most would feel that it's rather unimportant for a room full of Coloradans to be discussing Puerto Rico, or even know what it looks like, because that's not Puerto Rico. This is Puerto Rico. My point here is, although some don't believe it's important for a room full of Coloradans to be aware of this topic, I would argue that it absolutely is, because the ongoings of Puerto Rico have immense potential to affect all of us. You see, Puerto Rico is over $100 billion in debt, and that debt is only growing. Because Puerto Rico is a possession of the United States, whose residents are United States citizens, that debt ultimately falls on us. So what are we going to do? Well, before we can even get to that question, we have to trace what has happened in the last 50 years that has led to Puerto Rico's massive debt, as well as study the impact that Hurricane Maria has had on the island. If I was to give a brief economic overview of Puerto Rico's financial standings, it would begin in the 1970s with a tax break which was meant to help make the island more money. Now, this tax break was called Section 936, and that was of the United States Internal Revenue System, so a U.S.-supported tax law, essentially. For Puerto Rico, this meant a cut in taxes, which brought more business to the island. And that may confuse you, because I earlier said that this tax break was the result of, or was the beginning of Puerto Rico's financial woes. And make no mistake, although Section 936 once helped Puerto Rico, it would end up costing the island billions. And that's only in the long term, though, because Section 936, while it was active in the 1980s, it was helping the Puerto Rican economy. It was boosting the Puerto Rican economy. And all the while, the United States was losing money. Now, that prompted the United States to end Section 936 in 2006. It was really the end of Section 936 that started Puerto Rico's trouble with debt. Now, once Section 936 was ended, Puerto Rico saw businesses begin to move away from the island. And they saw an economic decrease in their productivity and their GDP. That scared them. And in response to that, they made things exponentially worse. They borrowed money to make up for their economic decrease. They thought that they could pay the money they borrowed back, but they actually ended up increasing their debt twofold over the period of 9 years, or from 2006 to 2015. And it was in 2015 that Puerto Rico defaulted on the loans they had taken out, meaning that they couldn't pay them. And this is when the United States had to step back in, because remember, Puerto Rican residents are United States citizens, which means that the federal government cannot simply leave them unaided. So the aid that the United States ended up offering Puerto Rico came in the form of a bill called PROMESA. Now, PROMESA is a bill that states that the United States president will appoint a board of members to take the reins of the Puerto Rican economy and steer it out of there. PROMESA was passed in 2016, and at the time it seemed like the best option for Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, though, just 14 months after PROMESA was passed, Hurricane Maria hit the island. And that concludes kind of the overview of Puerto Rico's economic history, up to today, that is. And if we really want to understand what Puerto Rico and Congress are talking about today, we must first go back to their first collaboration, Section 936, which all begins in 1976. The initial goal of Section 936 was to spread United States business from the mainland into Latin American territories in an effort to modernize those territories and boost them to a place where they can trade with the United States and become business partners, making everyone a profit, right? In other words, the United States gave companies tax exemptions to move to islands like Puerto Rico, create a boost in the Puerto Rican economy, which would then put the, islands like the Puerto Rican, Latin American territories in a better place to do business with the United States. And that's how it was sold to Puerto Rico, who saw it as a massive opportunity to take financial stake in the world. And they jumped on it. They soon saw tens of United States companies moving to their island and starting up business. At this time, specifically the early 1980s, everything was going great. The United States was starting to work with Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico's economy was climbing as a result. But I wonder, how are the businesses who took part in Section 936 faring? Well, In the end, it turns out that they made more money than either the United States or Puerto Rico. And this was all because of an oversight and the exemptions that Section 936 allowed. So Section 936, this tax code that's given to Puerto Rico and all Latin American countries, exempts businesses from federal income tax. And that's the incentive for businesses to move away from the mainland and into Puerto Rico. Now, federal income tax is the process by which the government will take a certain amount of a company or a person's money based on how much that company or person makes per year. Usually, the amount taken by federal income tax is relatively small compared to the total amount that one makes per year. But when you're dealing with something as big as a multi-million-dollar company who's exempted from this tax, the numbers can be thrown so out of proportion that the government ends up owing the company money. And that's exactly what happened in Section 936. Now, the clearest evidence of exactly how much these businesses made comes from a report done in 1993 by Jenny S. Stathis for the United States Committee on Finance. In her report, Stathis details that, on average, businesses paid around $22,000 per employee, and that's in wages. But those same businesses received $24,000 in tax returns. And that was an increase of $2,000 per employee per year, making the companies far more than the United States ever thought they could through Section 936. So of course, once the US realized this, they had the first thought to end Section 936 outright. And in the middle of the 1980s, they were about to. But they realized something. If they ended Section 936 so abruptly, they would sweep Puerto Rico's legs out from underneath it, because businesses in Puerto Rico who participated in Section 936 were employing thousands of Puerto Ricans and boosting the Puerto Rican economy by creating a flow of cash. Obviously, you don't want to do that, because Puerto Rico would fall into a recession, if Section 936 was ended. So instead of outright ending Section 936, United States Congress spends the rest of the 80s slowly raising the requirements for businesses who wanted to participate. They slowly demanded more be spent, more employees be employed, and they hoped that by doing so, they would cut down on the economic advantages these companies were taking as part of Section 936. Unfortunately, they just never raised the requirements high enough. Businesses still made too much for the United States to be able to pay, and in the 1990s, the United States realized that it could no longer afford Section 936. Its profit was going into the negative, which all led to a pivotal decision in 1996. The United States President, Bill Clinton, signed a motion that would end Section 936. Now, to avoid collapsing Puerto Rico's economy, Clinton gave a 10-year grace period where Section 936 was still active. And all this with the hopes of letting Puerto Rico use those 10 years to determine a new course of action. This seemed amicable to the United States, and Puerto Rico agreed with them for the sake of business. So the United States was happy. They had ended Section 936 and would no longer be losing money because of it. 1,100 miles away, however, Puerto Rico is in a state of panic. As soon as Section 936 was ended, they started to see businesses move away from the island, and they started to lose money. They started to panic, and they did the only thing they could think of at that time. They borrowed money. Now, they borrowed money through United States federal bonds, and if we were to chart it out, it would look something like this. The initial transaction is between Puerto Rico up here and the United States government. So Puerto Rico essentially sells a bond to the United States government, and that's an IOU from Puerto Rico that they will pay the amount of that bond back. In return for the initial sale of a bond, the United States will return with cash, finance. The idea being that Puerto Rico uses that immediate cash return to invest in their economy and eventually pay the United States back. And after the United States receives their IOU from Puerto Rico or their bond from Puerto Rico, they sell it to investment brokers like Charles Schwab and JP Morgan. Those investment brokers package Puerto Rico's IOU in with IOUs from other companies and bonds from other businesses, take that index fund and distribute it to the American people. So if you or your family has any money in United States bonds, you might own a little bit of Puerto Rico's debt. The idea behind all of this was really that Puerto Rico would take this initial cash return, invest in themselves, and be able to pay back the United States government within a couple of years. After that payment was made, it would flow through this line of people, making everyone a profit along the way, which sounds nice. The only problem is, that Puerto Rico used all the money it borrowed and did not have anything to show for it. Now, this led to them falling further into an economic recession when in 2015, their debt was close to $70 billion. That same year, they had only made $82 billion as a Commonwealth, and they could only use a small amount of that $82 billion to even put towards their loan. So they had no hopes of paying their loans, which contributed to them defaulting on their loans in 2015, when headlines all across Puerto Rico read, quoting the governor, "The debt is unpayable." And this, if you remember, is when the United States had to step back in and assist Puerto Rico. They did so through PROMESA, which is an act that states that the president will appoint a board of members to oversee the Puerto Rican economy. And if you're asking yourself, well, why, when Puerto Rico defaulted on its loans and realized that it couldn't pay the money back, it didn't just declare bankruptcy? Well, they tried. In 2016, Puerto Rico tried to file for federal bankruptcy, but the Supreme Court denied them. And that kind of left PROMESA as Puerto Rico's best option for long-term support from the United States. On August 31st, 2016, President Barack Obama appointed 4 members to the PROMESA board. That's pending further applications throughout the rest of his presidency. These 4 members begin their work on a plan to get Puerto Rico out of its debt. And they started implementing changes in the summer of 2017, just before Hurricane Maria hit the island. Now, before we get into the devastation that was Hurricane Maria, I want to revisit everything we've just talked about, because it is important for you to understand all of this clearly if you want to have a hope at understanding what Puerto Rican Congress are talking about right now. Let's start off back in 1976, when Section 936 exempted businesses from federal income tax. As a result of this, Puerto Rico's economy flourished, but the United States lost money. Now, because they lost money, the United States tried to rework Section 936, but ended up ending it outright. That started in 1996 and ended in 2006. After the end of Section 936, Puerto Rico saw businesses leave the islands and decided to borrow money as a result of this. They borrowed money through federal bonds. Puerto Rico ended up not being able to pay the money back and defaulted on the loans they had taken out in 2015, which forced the United States to intervene with PROMESA. Is everyone clear about that? Mm-hmm. Bear with me. It's a little dry, but hopefully we're getting to the fun part. Which brings us to current day, and essentially answers the first part of my question. We now understand what, in the past 50 years, has led to the economic recession of Puerto Rico. It's time to look at how Hurricane Maria has impacted the island. During the start of the school year, specifically in September, Puerto Rico was being ravaged by Hurricane Maria. Infrastructure, roads, bridges, vegetation was all destroyed by the storm. Not to mention there was an immense cost in life. And to this day, there are still some parts of the island that have no access to electricity or running water. All told, the cost of Hurricane Maria is estimated to be upwards of $90 billion. And that's all on top of Puerto Rico's pre-existing debt. Which brings us to current day, where Puerto Rico is weighing options with Congress. They haven't reached a conclusion. And we're still very much in the midst of this issue and still very much waiting for an outcome. And that essentially answers this research question. It was the end of Section 936 that prompted Puerto Rico to take out loans which it defaulted on that put it in the economic recession. And Hurricane Maria has impacted the island by adding $90 billion of additional costs, as well as impacting the population of Puerto Rico and the loss of life. Having answered my research question, I want to provide some perspective on what options Puerto Rico has now, because that sounds a lot better than ending halfway through. In February, I interviewed Professor Edwin Melendez, who is the director for the Center of Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College in New York. Professor Melendez explained to me that Puerto Rico has 2 main options in the immediate future. Either Congress grants the island billions of dollars in aid, along with that 90 billion figure, or Puerto Rico goes further into debt, trying to rebuild itself. As of today, we're kind of in the middle. Congress has given some aid to Puerto Rico, But according to Politico, Puerto Rican officials are still expressing that they'll need at least $90 billion additional dollars to be able to return the island to normal. And that's where it ends. We are still in the midst of this ongoing debate between Puerto Rico and Congress. And I encourage all of you to keep up to date on this issue because it is imperative for you to understand what Puerto Rico is going through right now. And I said that in my intro, and I say it now because it has a very real impact on both you and I. Who here has ever needed IV fluid for an operation or treatment? That's a fair amount of people. Well, I want to tell you the story of a company called Baxter International. Baxter International is one of the companies who moved to Puerto Rico during the time when Section 936 was available. They made their money, and even when Section 936 ended, Baxter International stayed on the island, producing IV fluid and supplying many of the hospitals in the continental US. And they worked there throughout the 2010s until last year, Hurricane Maria destroyed Baxter International's campus. Now, this led to a nationwide shortage in IV fluid. Last year, the Cincinnati Children's Hospital wasn't able to provide IV solution to nearly 1,000 patients. In December, Denver's Children's Hospital ran dangerously low on their IV saline solution, had to resort to ordering their nurses to manually deliver the nutrients that an IV bag usually does on its own. In January of this year, Pagosa Springs Medical Center reported a shortage in their supply of IV saline and had to borrow some from Mercy Medical Center here in Durango. Baxter International isn't the only manufacturer in Puerto Rico who exports to the United States, and we will soon see shortages in other pharmaceuticals and manufacturing. The consequences of Hurricane Maria are reaching into our backyard. So, whether you know what Puerto Rico looks like or where it is in our world, you must fully understand what it is going through, because what happened in Puerto Rico yesterday has the potential to affect you today. Thank you.